Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Ari Chukral, and I'm the Assistant Director of Foreign Policy at JINSA. We're joined today by Gabriel Naronha, who is a JINSA Gamunder Center Fellow. From 2019 to 2021, he served as Special Advisor for the Iran Action Group at the U.S. Department of State, where he coordinated policy and directed the State Department's communications and congressional affairs for Iran. From 2017 to 2019, he worked as the Special Assistant for the Senate Armed Services Committee under Chairman John McCain and Jim Inhofe. Today, we're going to discuss the dangers of expiring sanctions on Iran and the importance of a mechanism called snapback to putting pressure on the Iranian regime, both of which Gabriel recently wrote about in a paper called International Sanctions on Iran Are About to Collapse. I encourage everyone to read the paper, which you can find on JINSA's website. If you have any questions, please submit them through the Q&A function in Zoom. To start with some current context, the IAEA has recently claimed that Iran expanded its enrichment of nuclear material. Gabe, what did it find, and why is this level of enrichment dangerous?
So what we saw was with Iran recently is the IAEA detected uranium enriched up to 83.7%. That is just a stone's throw away from the 90% threshold, which is conventionally known as the sort of weapons grade uranium. But it's also important to note that there are alternative weapons designs which can be used with just as much as 83%. You can make certain weapons designs with that. Now, what we only saw was a small amount of uranium enriched at that level, but that tells you that the Iranians are experimenting. They're getting around close to that level and figuring out how they could do this on a mass scale. So they're learning the techniques, the technology, gaining the institutional knowledge, so that if they wanted to do a mass breakout, they'd be prepared and positioned to do so. We've heard from a lot of senior leaders and intelligence officials that if Iran chose to, it could have the fissile breakout material for several weapons within a matter of a week or so, maybe a little longer. But the short enough that we wouldn't be able to see it before they reach that likely. Now, we've also seen some alleged agreement between the IAEA and Iran to bring the temperature down a little bit. The issue is we've seen these a lot of times before, and we shouldn't have any confidence that Iran is going to keep to its side of the bargain. At every point I've worked on Iran, when I was in government, we saw behind the scenes that Iran was plotting how to deceive, deny, delay the IAEA inspectors, how they were trying to move things around and do whatever it takes just to buy a little bit more time for them to create more coercion. And so that's, I think, what we're seeing today is it's another trick by the Iranians to gain a little bit more time, put the pressure on the back burner, and they successfully avoided an IAEA resolution at the last Board of Governors meeting. Those are really crucial. That's how sanctions on Iran came to be in the first place, which we'll get to shortly.
Yes, we'll certainly get to that. And with that concerning context in mind for recent events, in your paper, you write that the international sanctions on Iran are about to collapse. But let's back up a bit first. When did the international community start sanctioning Iran because of its nuclear program, and what types of prohibitions were put in place? And as you discuss that, we have several graphics that I'll share throughout the webinar today that are all found in your paper.
So in the early 2000s, the United States and international community started recognizing that Iran was conducting its nuclear program. It took a couple of years for the United Nations to actually get going. And when it did, it started in 2006 with a series of UN Security Council resolutions on Iran's nuclear program. These started slow in July 2006, and then it really started building up significant international pressure and sanctions on Iran. And you can see the timeline here. So I'll let you guys read it, but what's important to know is these sanctions were unanimous and multilateral. That means China and Russia, as well as the European Union and the United States, were agreeing to all these sanctions. That's sort of a different world than we have now, where we have Russia and China covering for Iran at the United Nations. But what you see here on the left is Iran really getting under having consequences for its actions back in the 2000s. So the UN imposed firm prohibitions on Iranian uranium enrichment, on plutonium processing, heavy water reactor activity, as well as sort of terror activity. So the UN put sanctions on Iran's transfer, its sale and buying of conventional weapons like planes, trucks, tanks, submarines, as well as the nuclear delivery systems, things like long-range drones, and then most importantly, ballistic missiles.
And following up on that, why were these specific sanctions put in place, and how did they affect Iran's nuclear program and decision-making?
So what's important to know is if you look at the architecture of the nuclear non-proliferation legal structure, there's always been a firm prohibition on nations conducting uranium enrichment unless it is done for peaceful civilian programs within the strong confines of agreements with the IAEA, having a safeguards agreement. Other than that, it's a violation of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which Iran has signed on to. So these sanctions on Iran's uranium enrichment program also made it a lot harder for Iran to acquire things that it needs for building centrifuges, building nuclear program. Yes, you can develop everything indigenously if you put your heart and mind to it, much like North Korea has, but it's going to take years and years longer. And it's much harder when you have this international system of sanctions. There's always been leakage of those sanctions, but it's important to remember that because of these sanctions, and then later on the oil sanctions that were imposed by the United States and enforced internationally, that's what brought Iran to the table to begin with to negotiate the JCPOA. Without sanctions, without pressure, Iran would never have agreed to any talks at all, and then it never would have agreed to the Joint Plan of Action, the JPOA in 2014, or the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action in 2015. And that's important. Iran has always viewed itself as trying to be both its own independent actor, but they want to be involved in the world. They want to have the ability to travel where they want, to bank where they want, to buy what they want, both the Iranian people as well as their officials and sort of the state itself. And so to the extent that these sanctions were being enforced around the world, it was putting a lot of pressure on the regime. Its economy was tanking, and that's ultimately why it came to the table.
So you mentioned the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which people are probably familiar with also as the Iran nuclear deal. But what was in that deal, and how did the UN codify it through United Nations Security Council Resolution 2231?
So yes, so thanks, Ari. So there's two elements. So the JCPOA was a non-binding political agreement. It had no legal effect. And actually, if you look at the JCPOA itself, there's no signatures on it. So it is basically just a piece of paper. The reason for that was because both the US negotiators knew that it would never pass the Senate as a treaty, which is what would be required. And the Iranian parliament was not all that happy about it as well. And so they realized that without any legal effect to it, it would have a lot of limitations. So the negotiators went to the one vehicle where they thought they could get a semblance of legitimacy, which was the United Nations Security Council. And that's where they created the Security Council Resolution 2231. What that did was it combined all those 6 resolutions you saw in the previous chart. It cut them all off. So it ended all those resolutions, and then it combined many of the restrictions on Iran, but with a lot of caveats and a lot of changes. The big one is that it created these sunsets. So while all the previous UN Security Council resolutions, their restrictions on Iran were permanent, with the new one, they were all ones that would end between 2020 and 2025. on the Security Council resolution side. On the JCPOA itself, as you can see in this graph, elements of it continue on to 2041, and actually there's some that go on beyond that as well. But what happens is we've already seen the UN arms embargo on Iran expire. We've seen the visa bans on over 20 Iranian terrorists expire 3 years ago. And what we're coming up to shortly is going to be the next round of sanctions expiring on Iran. There's 3 sort of major problems here. One is the restriction on Iran's ballistic missile technology, on imports and exports of ballistic missiles and long-range drones. All that ends. So starting then, Iran is legally permitted to send ballistic missiles or drones to Russia, for example. It's been sending the drones already. It hasn't been sending ballistic missiles, partially because there's concerns that's a little too escalatory. But once they're legally able to do so, I think you're going to see the Iranian appetite to do so is going to increase. There's also visa bans and asset freezes on around 67 individuals and companies in the Iranian nuclear and ballistic missile system, which are all going to expire. At that point, there's nuclear scientists can travel around the world. The banking sanctions on a lot of Iranian procurement systems and companies are going to expire. And unless countries individually impose sanctions on them, there's nothing to stop them from doing whatever it takes to get a really strong nuclear infrastructure up and running. On the other side, and this is one thing that a lot of people don't know about the JCPOA, is both the United States and the European Union pledged that they were going to reduce sanctions on Iran as well. Now, there's a difference. I want to sort of, on the chart, there's the left side, the UN, and there's the right side, the JCPOA. The right side, the JCPOA, are all commitments. It's political agreements. It's just the word of the leaders who have chosen to sign it. That's why the United States said we're not going to abide by our restrictions and our commitments, and Iran hasn't either. On the left side, you have international sanctions with legal binding, which do expire. And those are not at the whims of individuals. It's sort of set in writing, set in stone. So the ones on the left will end when they say they do. The ones on the right are really dependent on the governments and the leaders and what they choose to do. But the European Union said that it would end its arms embargo on Iran, including ballistic missile and drone technology, in October 18th of this year. The US also pledged to end a lot of sanctions on Iran, which it's not going to do because Congress won't actually agree to do so. And Iran agreed to ratify the IAEA's additional protocol, which is about sort of nuclear safety and nuclear various transparency measures to the IAEA. Iran's not going to do any of that either. So what you see on the right side is sort of the result of a dead JCPOA, a dead political commitment that no one believes in anymore, no one's going to abide by. This starts getting tricky in 2025 on what's called Termination Day. That's the day on which the United Nations Security Council formally ends its consideration of the Iranian nuclear program. At that time, all UN sanctions on Iran expire. And more importantly, as we're about to get into, the mechanism where the UN sanctions can be returned on Iran expires as well. So what we'll talk about is the ability for the international community and for the United States and Europe to keep Iran sanctions on Iran expires in 2025. If they don't choose to use that option, it goes away. So it's a use it or lose it tool.
So you mentioned that after the JCPOA went into effect, it's a non-binding political agreement, and that Iran wasn't adhering to it. Could you provide more details on how they violated it, as well as violations of UNSCR 2231 as well?
Sure. So, there's 6 major commitments that Iran made in the JCPOA, so on the right side. Some of those are technical, but they all come down to uranium and centrifuges. So it's how much uranium you're keeping in country. Are you keeping 300 kilograms or above or below? That was what they pledged to do. They started having higher stockpiles was the first thing they did. Then there's the uranium purity levels, which they were capped at 3.67%. Iran started going to 4.5% and then 20%, 60%. Now they're at 80, almost 84%. There's enrichment purity, enrichment volume. Then there's centrifuges, how many centrifuges you have, how sophisticated those centrifuges are, and then what research and development you're doing with them, and then your heavy water activity and plutonium reprocessing. Iran started breaking each of its commitments in May of 2019. And every 2 months, they would break a new commitment. And this was part of their way that they saw themselves as gaining leverage on the West. By May 2020, they had reached all of their commitments in the JCPOA. Now, the UN Security Council resolutions, and what we'll talk about in a second, is the things that happen in the JCPOA when you violate it allow you to snap back the left side of the chart, the UN sanctions. But when you
I can bring up that chart now.
So when you violate UN, so this is a little bit of a weird process, and this is technical, and this is what gets a lot of it takes a long time digging through really technical legal details to understand this process. If you break, and Iran did this many times, if you break the UN Security Council resolution restrictions, that doesn't matter. People put out a lot of statements, but unless the international community decides to put penalties on it, there's no legal consequence for, say, selling your arms to the Houthis, selling your arms to Russia. Same with the travel ban. Qasem Soleimani was all over Baghdad and Beirut and other places he wasn't legally allowed to be. But that didn't give the UN the standing to prevent those sanctions from expiring. What does is when Iran starts violating its JCPOA commitments. The moment that happens, this flow chart starts becoming relevant. Here's the goal of this flow chart. The goal is for a country to say Iran isn't meeting its commitments, and therefore it shouldn't get the benefits of the deal either. And if this process succeeds, then all the sanctions on Iran snap back at the United Nations. And they go back to their original state before the JCPOA. You see all those sanctions from 2006, 2010 come back into place, and they're permanent. And this is a very weird, complex process. There's an optional process you see on your left, and then a mandatory required process on your right. So if you want to play nicely, if you want to play in the sandbox and do things according to the diplomatic rules and norms, you can go into the JCPOA's, what they call the Joint Commission, which is a sort of a fancy way of saying all the nations which signed on to the JCPOA, you all get each other in the room and you talk about your feelings and your concerns for what the violation is. You have 15 days where you try to work it out. If that hasn't been worked out, you go to the foreign ministers, or you can go to an advisory board and you do another 15 days and another 5 days of mediation. The goal of this process is to get a resolution to those violations. The way that the 2015 negotiators wanted it to be was, we want to find a way to keep this deal together. And so you have all these steps of sort of counseling, mandatory counseling. But if that doesn't work after 35 days, you say, okay, it's time for a divorce. We're going to the UN Security Council. Now, when the United States did this in 2020, we said, we've already reviewed the evidence. We don't need counseling. We've tried counseling for 2 years and more to try to have fix something between us. We're going straight to divorce. And that process happens at the UN Security Council. What happens is at the council, which is 15 members, so you have your permanent 5, the US, UK, France, Russia, and China, and then you have a rotating cast of 10 other countries who rotate in and out of the council. in our case, when the United States did this, we submit this resolution to the president of the Security Council saying that Iran's not meeting its commitments. It is in significant non-performance, to use the legal term, of its commitments. Normally, when you have a UN resolution, to pass something, to pass sanctions, you need the support of every permanent member, and you need a simple majority. But what you can't have is you can't have a veto, then that resolution dies. Snapback is strange. It's probably the only way it's ever been done in this manner, where it's a reverse vote. Instead of saying we want to reimpose sanctions on Iran, you're actually asking nations, do you want to keep sanctions on Iran? And if anyone says no, sorry, if you want to keep the sanctions relief on Iran, if any nation says no, in this case, the United States, France, Russia, and China, then all those old sanctions on Iran come back into place. So the only way for sanctions relief to stay in effect is if every member unanimously says, hey, we don't want this, we want sanctions relief to remain. That doesn't make sense because if someone introduces a resolution, it makes sense that that they would vote against it. Now, this is a 30-day window. So within 30 days, if the UN Security Council hasn't passed a resolution saying we want the sanctions relief to be in place, then all the sanctions snap back into place. That's why we call this process snapback. Now, the United States tried this in 2020. I was part of the team that led it. And this was very, very controversial. The key controversy is basically because the drafters of the JCPOA and the Security Council resolution were a little vague on what happens if a country like the United States leaves the JCPOA. Can it still conduct snapback? This happens to fall down into weird legal wording, which is basically they didn't say. They didn't consider that possibility and they didn't write anything about it. The United States said we were listed in the original, in UN Security Council 2231, we were listed as a JCPOA participant, defined that way in the resolution, not in the JCPOA itself. We were actually defined in the UN Security Council resolution. It didn't give any mechanism in that resolution to tell how we disband that deal, how we leave that deal. That's a JCPOA process. All the other nations sort of said, that doesn't sound right. You left the JCPOA, you said you left the JCPOA, so you don't have the right to snap back anymore. That put this UN Security Council in a very strange position. The US said that it had conducted snapback and that all the sanctions were back in place. And all the other countries on the Security Council said, no, you didn't. So there were two parallel existing legal architectures running at the same time. What the US said and believed was its legal position, that all the old sanctions had snapped back into place, and everyone else who said, no, Iran has gotten sort of sanctions relief now. So that created a very strange system where a lot of people said the UN Security Council has effectively been broken. So not the most harmonious decision at the UN Security Council, and I'm happy in Q&A to talk about my feelings on what went wrong or how one could do that better. But we'll go on. We'll do a little bit more first.
So happy to dig into that as well. But to kind of put a fine point on where this process broke down, here on the flow chart, when the Trump administration invoked snapback, where did we stop?
So here we started with any JCPOA state can submit complaint, which is what we did. Everyone really objected to the idea that we were that JCPOA participant, so they didn't object to the rest of it. They literally only had objection to that one clause. Now, normally, what they expected was that another state, say Iran or Russia, would introduce a resolution saying we want 2231 to stay in place. We like this setup. And that's the resolution that would be fighting, that we would veto. Now, all the other nations actually said, we're not going to play ball. So we're not going to introduce that resolution at all. There's a sort of a provision that says if that's the case, then the UN Security Council president does that. They sort of act as the referee. They throw the ball into the field. The UN Security Council president said, I'm not sure what's going on here. We're not going to play here because we're just the referee. We're trying to stay. So it was actually the United States that introduced the resolution saying that we wanted 2231 to stay in place. We wanted sanctions removed. It was a very strange procedural process. Then what we did is we went and held a vote on that resolution, and we vetoed our own resolution. Everyone else voted for the resolution.
That's a strange occurrence.
It was very strange. So again, this is what happens when drafters don't create good legislation, is you have a process that no one knows what's happening and everyone can claim that they were victorious. So we vetoed it. And so we put out a statement. I wrote that statement defining exactly which legal provisions and which sanctions on Iran had come back into place. And you can, if you are interested in Googling that, you can see it and it shows everything, but it's basically what you see at the bottom of this flow chart of all those 6 old Security Council resolutions are in place. And most of the new 2231 is terminated. Now, that's how it started. That's how it lasted for about 6 months. One of the first things that the Biden administration did when they came into office on Iran was they actually went and they said, we take all that back. We are undoing snapback. We do not believe that 2231 is terminated. We believe it is alive. The old council resolutions are dead. And by doing so, they sort of said the US position is Iran is free to export arms around the world. The travel bans have been lifted, and that's just what we're going to do. Their intent, as they said at the time, was they wanted to facilitate diplomacy with Iran. They thought that it would make the Europeans happier at us, and it would make the Iranians willing to talk to us and have a deal. What we've seen in the last year plus is that hasn't accomplished anything. There's been no new deal. The Iranians don't talk to us. And worse, the Iranians are violating even more of both the JCPOA and UN Security Council Resolution 2231. Especially, and this is, I think, the thing that's most concerning to European countries is they're sending hundreds of drones, maybe thousands of drones to Russia to be used by Putin in attacking Ukrainian cities, civilians, power infrastructure, and causing really significant damage there. And then, of course, on the JCPOA side, we're seeing Iran get really close to that nuclear breakout period. So this leads the question to both the United States and to Europe. Are we going to use snapback now? Are we going to let more parts of the UN sanctions expire, or are we going to act to do something? If you're in the United States shoes, you sort of say, okay, we've seen what unilateral US snapback does. It doesn't work too well because the other nations just say you're not allowed to do it. So this sort of goes to the Europeans, and it's the Europeans have continued to be JCPOA participants since day one. So there's no ambiguity whether they have that right to snap back. And the Europeans are now sort of debating internally whether they are going to use the snapback process. Again, they've been threatening to use snapback for years. 3 years ago, when I was at the State Department, the Europeans said, hey, if Iran goes to 20% uranium enrichment, that's really serious. We might have to use snapback for it. Then it was, well, if they go to 60% uranium enrichment, that's the end of it. That's snapback. And we don't want to use snapback because we want to deter Iran from going to 20%. We want to deter Iran from going to 60%. Now what I'm hearing is the same thing. It's, well, we don't want Iran to go to 90%. So we're going to threaten snapback. And what I'm increasingly hearing now is, well, we don't want Iran to go to build a weapon. So if they go to 90%, we're still going to hold it out. It should be clear to everyone that if you act like that, Iran doesn't view your threat seriously at all. And that's what we've seen is Iran ignores the Europeans, they ignore all their statements, they ignore all their threats, and nothing happens to them. So that's why I think it's really important for the United States, both Congress as well as the executive branch, to come in and weigh in and say, we need Europe to act. We need them to engage in the snapback activity, because if they don't do so soon, one, all the sanctions on Iran are going to end. And if we keep holding out for 2.5 years, there's no way to get these sanctions to snap back on Iran at all. Once snapback ends in October 2025, if you want new sanctions on Iran to come back, you need to go to Beijing and Moscow and get their approval to put new sanctions on Iran. I think everyone who's listening can tell that will never, ever happen.
I want to remind everyone that they can submit questions through the Q&A tab in Zoom, and I'd be happy to read those to Gabe while people are sending those in. We've been talking a lot about snapback, but Iran's already violating its commitments. So what would snapback actually accomplish today?
So if you actually, this is, I get asked a lot, if Russia is going to violate the sanctions, what does it matter if we do snapback? And there's a lot of things that snapback actually does, even if Russia is going to violate it, that are important. First is it punishes Iran by putting legal sanctions and prohibitions against Iranian nuclear enrichment. It makes those restrictions permanent. You have permanent arms embargoes on Iran, both its conventional weapons and its ballistic missiles. And one of the things that does is that allows every foreign nation to both have the power and, in fact, they have the obligation to take all steps to prevent Iran from using their territory, their ships, their water, their airplanes, from engaging in these activities. So let's say you're Germany, and an Iranian plane lands in your country, and you have reason to believe that they're trying to buy centrifuge equipment. You now, under this UN Security Council resolution, have the right to search that plane. And if there's items there that are going to Iran for their nuclear program, you can confiscate them. The same goes for Iranian weapons. So right now, Iran often sends large boats full of weapons bound for Yemen. The United States can interdict those weapons on the high seas and confiscate them, and we've done that numerous times. In this case, we're doing that. There's a separate Yemen resolution in the Security Council that gives us that legal authority. Well, let's say that Iran was shipping weapons to, say, India or Oman or any other country. We now have that legal right to go in and block them from doing so. That's an incredibly important legal authority to have, for all nations to have. And every nation is supposed to report back to the United Nations how they are actually enforcing these sanctions that they're doing. There's other technical things that are helpful when you have the snapback happen. But I think there's two really broad things. One is, I would say, it says a message that if Iran breaks its commitments, there are penalties. Sanctions come back. Countries can do things. And that says you don't have impunity to act however you like. You don't have impunity to enrich all these weapons, to break the edicts of the Security Council. And I think the latter one is the really important one. If the UN is going to say that it has beliefs that the UN Security Council has chosen to make these sort of legal pronouncements, it needs to actually enforce them. And if you don't enforce your laws, then they're basically meaningless. And so this is a question for the Security Council: does it want to be a relevant institution? Does it want to have its views and its beliefs actually upheld by its new member states? Or is it just a place where a bunch of diplomats go to New York and and have fun and dress up. So this is really a question of, does the institution of the United Nations matter at all? Do they want it to matter? And that's one of the most important questions, I think, for international diplomacy, especially as we're sort of in this new the new Cold War era, is what do the institutions look like, and how do we respond to threats to peace and stability?
As you've noted, the European signatories to the JCPOA do not believe the U.S. has the right to evoke snapback, which is what held up the Trump administration's claim. And obviously, the Biden administration has since withdrawn that claim of snapback. But what can the United States do to encourage the Europeans to invoke it themselves? You laid out a number of recommendations in your paper.
Yeah. So one is, we should go, a part of this is top senior level diplomacy. The president should be making calls to European leaders and asking them what's their plan to prevent these sanctions from expiring. Secretary Blinken, the special envoy for Iran, and our UN ambassador should engage with their counterparts daily, asking them, what is the plan? How are we going to stop Iran from sending more missiles to Russia, from equipping our enemies, equipping terrorists? I don't get the sense that there's a lot of urgency in this administration on doing so. They need to have that urgency. They also need to have a strategy. If snapback happens, how do we convince all those third countries around the world to actually enforce the sanctions that have been reimposed? It's going to take a lot of diplomacy, a lot of officers around the world going and saying, we now have a legal right to interdict Iranian weapons. We have a legal right to ensure that Iran doesn't get a nuclear weapon, and we intend to force it. Same for Congress. Look, when I was in Congress, we'd often have delegations of European parliamentarians, European officials, and every time, they want to know what we care about. And if you're a congressional staffer or you're a member of Congress, you should be engaging with your European counterparts and saying, we want to make sure that Iran is punished for its activities and its aggression around the world, not encouraged, and so that's important. They also need to ask the Biden administration, what is your strategy to make sure that these sanctions don't expire? This is something that when the JCPOA was negotiated in 2015, President Obama, Vice President Biden, and John Kerry went to the Hill. They went all around and they were asked, so what are you going to do when these sanctions expire? They sort of said two things. They said, one, that's a problem. It's a serious problem. And they said, we're going to use diplomacy and we're going to work to try to make sure this deal is a better, stronger deal. Well, they've tried that. It hasn't worked. And they need to own up that it's been a failure. But they also need to realize you need to take, if your old approach isn't working, you need to go to a new approach. This also, the other thing that they said when they sold the deal to Congress and the American people is they sold it on the notion that we had the opportunity to snap back sanctions. There's all sorts of videos. You have President Obama, Vice President Biden saying, we alone have that legal right to snap back sanctions on Iran. Now, if this administration is going to go and say, actually, we don't have that legal right anymore, that's pretty hypocritical because that's what they sold it to the American people on. And if they want to retain their reputation, they should go to the Europeans and say, you need to do this for us as well. That's how you make amends. That's how you make it right with the American people, which is who the Obama administration sold this deal to.
So just as a plug, JINSA has been tracking the many, many months that the administration has been saying that there's no, the deal cannot be negotiated forever. And we've been tracking that for many months across the administration. And yet the administration has still not come out and said that they're moving on to a plan B. Another plug that JINSA has also written a report on what a plan B for Iran could certainly entail. We have a question from Norman Lipoff. How high a priority is it at this time for the U.S. administration and the State Department to prevent Iran from having nuclear weapons?
let me paint a picture for what a world with Iranian nuclear weapons would look like. And first, it's helpful to look at what are they doing today without a nuclear weapon. They are working to assassinate. They are working to assassinate over about a dozen American U.S. officials and dissidents on our soil. They are sending drones to Russia to kill Ukrainian civilians. They are plotting terrorist attacks and have conducted terrorist attacks in over 40 countries across the world. They've conducted hundreds of assassinations. And what they regularly do is they use hostages, and sometimes those are people, sometimes those are tankers that they basically capture. And they use those to coerce foreign governments into doing what they want. So they'll say, we'll release your tanker if you release these frozen funds. We'll release this hostage if you release this terrorist that we captured who was trying to blow up a rally, or we demand that you release this person that tried to kill a bunch of police officers in the United States. That's what they do with people and oil tankers. If you imagine Iran having a nuclear weapon, they can use that tactic of hostage taking and terrorism to every country in the world. They will provide nuclear threats to. They have stated repeatedly their intention to wipe Israel off the face of the map. Some people often ask me, should we take that seriously? And I think what I always say is the greatest mistake that people in democratic free countries make is we don't take our enemies seriously when they tell us their intentions publicly and repeatedly. When the Nazis said they were going to exterminate the Jews, when the Soviets said that they were going to spread communism, when Putin said that that Ukraine wasn't a country, when China says that now about Taiwan, we should take that seriously, really seriously. And so that's why it must be a priority for the US to ensure that Iran doesn't get a nuclear weapon. So the good news is Biden administration officials have now, only in the last few months, said publicly they will not allow Iran to get a nuclear weapon. And I believe them, and I want to believe them because the alternative is very dangerous. Now, there's words and then there's actions. The actions that you need to see are, you need to see the US administration providing Israel, for example, with the equipment to help do so. You need to see more defense spending so that we actually have the ability to carry out these operations. And we need to, on the rhetorical side, make it clear that there are consequences when Iran crosses us, when Iran does things. When Iran thinks that it can act with impunity, it will, and it will test us. So establishing and maintaining deterrence across the spectrum is vital to ensuring that Iran doesn't go for that nuclear weapon. I don't want to see us have to strike Iran's nuclear program and facilities. It's not going to be pretty when it happens. The best way we can prevent that is by showing Iran that there are consequences for its actions every day. And snapback is one of those consequences.
Your point about ensuring Israel and our partners have the capabilities that they need should it become necessary to launch a strike against Iran's nuclear program. JINSA organized a letter that appeared in the Hill earlier this week, signed by 44 military leaders, calling on the Biden administration to expedite delivery of necessary equipment like KC-46 tankers, F-35, F-15s, and precision-guided munitions as well. So that's really key to ensuring that a potential Israeli strike would be as effective as possible. We have another question in from Mally Rosebach. The policy of the Biden administration, of President Biden, is clearly helping the mullahs. They're selling over 1 million barrels of oil daily. They buy weapons in black market, killing Ukrainians and the Iranian opposition. How is this justified? How does this continue to go on?
It's not justified, and they shouldn't be doing this. And it's a shame that Iran is able to export 1 million barrels of oil per day. Let me give some numbers for context of what Iran was doing, both before the deal and what we got them down to. So in a sort of the regular state of order, without sanctions, Iran is able to export about 2.5 million barrels of oil per day. That's a lot. That gives them tens and tens of billions of dollars. It used to fund about half of Iran's budget overall. In the round of international sanctions in 2011 to 2014, the international community was able to bring Iran down to about 1 million barrels of oil per day. That's because they really, at the end of the day, weren't that aggressive at taking Iranian oil off the market. When we started the maximum pressure campaign on Iran, we took all the holds out. We used every method possible to prevent Iran from exporting oil. And we got Iran down significantly, as low as at 1.70 thousand barrels of oil per day, generally around 200, 300,000 barrels of oil per day. That took Iran's oil revenue down almost to zero. And as a result, they weren't able to fund their proxies. They weren't able to fund Hamas. They weren't able to fund Hezbollah. They had to lay off thousands of fighters. The funding for the IRGC was cut by double digits. Now what we're seeing is the results when you release pressure. They're selling 1 million barrels of oil per day. They're able to sell weapons to Russia, killing Ukrainians. In terms of how this affects domestically, they were able to increase their funding for jails and sort of black houses where they torture dissidents by over 300%. Their funding for the IRGC and domestic forces increased by double digits. That resulted in the deaths of dozens, if not hundreds, of Iranian dissidents and protesters. So there are real life consequences to not enforcing sanctions. And we know now that there's a whole fleet of ghost tankers who ship Iranian oil around the world. There hasn't been any sanctions on them. There hasn't been sanctions on the ship captains, on the ship crew. We used to make it very clear to every single sailor, mariner, ship captain, ship company, insurer around the world, you had a choice. You could either work with the Iranian oil smuggling networks that supported terrorism, and if you did so, you would be sanctioned and you would never be able to work with the West again. Or you had an option, you could work with us. You could stop working with Iran. And we even offered sort of the rewards for justice program, where if you want to turn your oil over, you can get a benefit out of it. This administration is not using those tools. They're not being proactive. They're slapping a few sanctions on things here and there, but they're focused on the things that look good, but they're not focused on the output. And that's why we've seen Iran be able to export more oil today than they have in 5 years.
We have another question in. Israel doesn't have the ability to attack each nuclear facility at the same time. The only way Israel could attack all Iran's nuclear facilities at one time is with the U.S. help and with bunker buster bombs. Only a tactical nuclear warhead would completely destroy each of Iran's facilities. I'm wondering if you could maybe respond to that claim and what the United States could do to help Israel better.
There's lots I'd like to say, which I can't say on a public thing like this. Here's what I will say. We want to make sure that Israel has the ability to take out all of its facilities on its own without U.S. help. Imagine if the scenario is, let's say it's 2028, the Iranian program comes to a head, but we're engaged in a full-out war in the Pacific theater with China. We might not have everything to spare to be able to go do this. So we want Israel to be able to do this by itself if it needs to. We should also be able to retain the ability that we can do it by ourselves if Israel is, say, under attack from some other way. In terms of, can we hit all facilities at one time? I don't think we have to, no, I don't believe we need to use a nuclear warhead to do this. I think there are other ways we can do so. I think we can, if there's the will, take out, I think we can prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. If there is the political will, we can do so. I really wish I could say more than that. I can't say more than that. That is unclassified. But it comes down to, again, I hope we do not have to go to this point. We don't have to. There's always been this narrative of the alternative to a deal is war. The only option is we have to strike at Iran's programs. We've been out of the deal for nearly 5 years. We haven't had to strike Iran's nuclear program. The reason is because we've had deterrence against Iran. We've ensured they know that if they go to nuclear breakout, there are consequences. That is the most important thing we can do, is ensure that they don't misconstrue our will to take out their program and impose consequences on them. When that fails, it's really dangerous. That failed. That idea of deterrence, we kind of broke down a little bit in 2019 because we chose not to respond to certain Iranian attacks. The result is Iran tried to take out our embassy in Iraq. They tried to take all our diplomats hostage. We had to restore deterrence by killing Qasem Soleimani. That got the message to them pretty clear that they weren't going to mess with us and that there were consequences to those actions. We should keep Iran understanding that's the case. And that's how I think we avoid this situation.
If you had the pen on the JCPOA, or we'll say maybe not the JCPOA, but a different nuclear agreement that was better and didn't have sunsets and things like that. But if you had the pen on a nuclear agreement with Iran, how would you have devised it so that there's less ambiguity when it comes to the snapback flowchart to improve snapback going forward?
You know, it was really over a pretty small question, which was, who is allowed to do snapback? And the question is, do you define the country? Do you just say, no, United States, France, Germany, and Russia can do snapback? Or do you make some fancy conditionality? And what they tried to do is they were trying to be a little too clever because they were linking two different legal systems. So if I were them, I could have just said, here are the countries which are allowed to do snapback. And that's it. And if you wanted to say, if you have left the JCPOA, you are no longer allowed to do snapback, that would have been fine. It would have provided that clarity. The issue is they left out a line. There were a lot of things, this agreement was written pretty fast. There were a lot of things that, later on people realized, oh, we missed this, we missed that. This was one of those things they missed. Although I think it's important to note, what's not important, this is a relatively minor issue. The big issue is the massive capitulations they gave to Iran throughout this negotiating process. And I think the biggest ones were these facts that the sanctions relief to Iran was not conditioned on Iran actually meeting its agreements and abiding by UN sanctions. They were untethered from reality. They were untethered from the actual actions out on the ground. They were just sort of rewards to Iran that if they stayed in the deal long enough, they got this relief. And I think one thing we've seen is we should never tie policy choices to an artificial calendar, an artificial timeline. When you do that, it tends to result in bad policy being made. And it allows the enemy, in this case, Iran, to just wait you out. That's what Iran is trying to do. They've just trying to wait us out, and then all the sanctions on them will end. That's their ardent hope.
Gabe, do you have any final thoughts before we conclude today?
The way I would phrase it is, do we want to live in a world where Iran thinks it can get away with whatever it wants? If that is the world we're in, Iran will continue taking advantage of us. Iran will strike inside America. They are trying to assassinate many of my former colleagues right now. Or do we want a world in which Iran is on the defensive? Iran is worrying about what we will do. And they are the ones under pressure, and they feel unsafe if you're part of their terrorist operations. We should get back to that scenario. And snapback will not cure everything, but it will make an incredibly important statement that their diplomatic hostage taking doesn't work. and that there are consequences to its actions. If Iran learns the wrong lessons, there are implications and consequences across the world as a result. So that's why snapback's important. I want to thank everyone that listened in, and if you have any questions, for me, you can get in touch with me through JINSA or through social media. Always happy to help.
Well, I want to thank our audience and Gabe for joining us today. Once again, I'll encourage everyone to read Gabe's excellent paper and engage with JINSA's other work by going to our website, jinsa.org, and look for our next webinar invite in your email inbox. I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their day.